Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 12, Psychological Disorders, and then Chapter 13 will be Treatment of those disorders. A word of wisdom, a word of warning before we get going here. There is such a thing as called medical student syndrome. And this is when folks go off to med school, they start to learn about diseases and different ailments, and then they start to diagnose themselves with those diseases or ailments, even though they don't have them. The same thing can happen here. As we go through this particular unit, we're going to hit slides and you're going to think, wait a minute, I've felt that before. I've experienced that before. Don't start diagnosing yourself. Don't get worried. Don't diagnose other people. That's not what we're here for. This is an introduction to psychology class. So we're just going to get some basics out here. On the flip side, if you do feel like there are enough signs and symptoms that concern you, you've been concerned about them before, no reason not to make a phone call. A lot of good help out there, so don't hesitate to do so if you really feel like there's been enough red flags. Okay, let's go with psychological disorders here. What is a psychological disorder? The first thing that we start to think about when we look at psychological disorders are patterns. Patterns of emotions, behaviors, or thoughts that can do one or more of these things. Number one, they're inappropriate to the situation, so they are deviant. We have a real strong negative connotation with the word deviant. Some of the words that the psychology field uses are also used out in everyday vocabulary, and they have different nuances to them, and sometimes it's more than nuances. Those connotations can be a lot stronger in the way that they're used in everyday language than what they're used in the psychology field. So keep that in mind. I think deviant is one of those terms. Leading to personal distress. If emotions, behaviors, or thoughts are distressful on a daily basis to somebody, that's going to be an indication of a possible psychological disorder. The inability to achieve important goals, you get the maladaptive or dysfunctional behaviors, emotions, or thoughts. If they're irrational, and oftentimes somebody that's thinking irrational thoughts has another part of their mind going, this is irrational, this is illogical, but those thoughts consume them so much that it overtakes that rational, logical part of their thinking. Or those emotions, behaviors, or thoughts are just unpredictable. You don't know when they're going to come up. Those are all possible indicators of psychological distress or disorder. A couple of synonyms there. One of the texts that we're going to reference a lot is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. This is the most widely accepted classification in the United States. So physicians will have this on their desks, psychologists will have this on their desks. We're obviously not going to go through this entire thing. We're going to hit the basics, but you need to know that term DSM-5. I don't remember off the top of my head if your textbook was written after the DSM-5 came out. So the textbook might reference the DSM-4. I don't think it does, but just in case you see DSM-4, just know that there is a more updated manual than the fourth edition. Okay. A few signs that suggest severe psychological disorders. And especially with the first two terms here, it's really important to make the distinguishing, to know how they are distinguished from one another. And the first one is hallucinations. Hallucinations are false sensory experiences. So you actually sense that voice talking to you, or you actually see somebody following you. Your senses are telling you something and you're experiencing those sensations, even though that they're not really there. That's as opposed to delusions. Delusions are false beliefs. So you believe somebody is following you. Oftentimes this comes in the form of conspiracies, like the mafia is out to get me. Now, delusions and hallucinations can certainly coexist. Oftentimes you'll see them together, but not always. So it's really important that you know how they are different from one another. Hallucinations, you're actually sensing something. Delusions, you believe something. And then severe affective or emotional disturbances. When we talk about somebody's affect, that is how they present their emotional state. Well, when that emotional state is presented at a very, again, irrational, illogical, exaggerated manner, then we consider that a severe affective disturbance. And when that's happening repeatedly, it could be a sign of severe psychological disorder. Now, in your book, early on in the chapter, it talks about some of the history in treating medical disorders. And it's a brutal history. It is not something that humanity should be proud of whatsoever. What we have developed over the course of the last century and a half, couple of centuries, is this idea of the medical model, that mental illness is a disease that's based on our biopsychology. So there are physiological reasons for our disorders. Of course, one of those would be in our genetics. Schizophrenia is a very famous example of this with epigenetics. We've talked about epigenetics a little bit in previous chapters. So epigenetics is when we have a gene that's lying dormant within us. It's not doing anything, but it's just there. And it needs an environmental factor to trigger it, to turn it on. Now, with schizophrenia, we don't always know what those environmental factors are. Sometimes it's a major case of stress. Sometimes it's something that is just not known to the individual. But they have found that schizophrenia has a high epigenetic component, that the gene is there. It just needs an environmental factor for it to turn on. And then, of course, neurochemistry. We talked about this in Chapter 3. Serotonin, if you remember, that's that mood neurotransmitter. And if there's an imbalance in serotonin, it can severely affect our moods. That's where we get our SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. But you can see here, this is all based on the idea that it's our physiology that's causing some sort of mental disorder, mental disturbance. Now, the DSM is broken into different categories of mental disorders in general. So the first category that we're going to talk about are anxiety disorders. Panic disorder is one that is most often characterized by dread, fear, sweating, etc. It's when that sympathetic nervous system gets triggered, but we don't know what the trigger is. There's no real connection to the current experience. So somebody might just be sitting in a movie theater waiting for a movie to start, and then all of a sudden feel this panic all of a sudden arise on them. Or sitting in a classroom, or sitting in the food court, wherever it might be. But there's no real reason to be stressed, let alone feel that panic. And that word dread is a big one with panic disorder. They feel like this oncoming dread, but they can't explain it. They don't know why they're feeling it. Agoraphobia is oftentimes thought about as somebody that doesn't want to leave their house. Now, agoraphobia is a fear of either really enclosed spaces or fear of public spaces or open spaces. And you think, well, wait a minute, is it the fear of open or is it the fear of enclosed? The key there is that last sentence, characterized by the fear of not being able to escape. So you can be out in a crowd, but feel like you can't escape that crowd. Or you feel like, you're down in Riverfront Park. It's this huge open space, but it's so huge and open, it's like, how do I get out of this? On the flip side, you can get somebody with agoraphobia that's really fearful of enclosed spaces for the exact same reason. In an elevator, in a very tight room, something like that, because you feel like you can't get to a place of safety and comfort. And that's why oftentimes with agoraphobia, you hear about somebody that doesn't want to leave their home because that's their place of comfort. And going out into the public, they feel like they can't get back. That's oftentimes severe agoraphobia when you just can't leave your house. That's a little note about OCD. We'll talk about that later on. Now, with several of these disorders, what has to happen is that as they look at diagnosing them, they look at how many symptoms you've had and for how long you've had them. This is a good slide as far as an example of what I was talking about at the beginning of the video. Let's just put all of the symptoms out here. Restlessness, feeling on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, just being irritable, going back to that being on edge, having tension in your muscles that's really not explainable, or sleep disturbances, either falling asleep too easily, but it's not a satisfying sleep, it's not a good restful sleep, or just not being able to fall asleep at all. Now, we've all had this. This is what I mean by it's a good example of what I was mentioning at the beginning of the video. We've all experienced these at one point or another. You'll notice, though, that for diagnosing generalized anxiety disorder, you need at least 3 of these symptoms for the majority of days over a 6-month period. They have to definitely be a pattern, like I mentioned on that first slide. All right, that's 10 minutes. There's more anxiety disorders, but I'm going to let Mr. Woodard take over from here.